session, I'm going to focus on one of the powerful derivative instruments which is making heavy inroads into the typical financial markets today. Probably the first of the swap transaction happened, let's say, 4 decades back, 40 years ago. But what we are seeing is a phenomenal growth over the last 40 years. We are seeing a lot of phenomenal growth, and probably one of the major instruments in the OTC market. So we need to understand what a swap is. Just on an overview, when I have to talk about a swap, just like any other derivative, it's an agreement between two parties, right? And this is an over the counter agreement itself, an agreement between the two parties wherein each party agrees to exchange a series of cash flows in future based on some kind of an agreement. A is agreeing to pay something to B, and B is agreeing to pay something to A, and this is not a one time payment. Generally it is a series of cash flows on so the dates on which the cash flows will be exchanged, the way in which the calculation of these cash flows will happen, both of them will be mentioned as a part of this swap agreement. But in short, two parties A and B are getting into an agreement to exchange a series of cash flows at a future date. So it might so happen that A might agree to paying some kind of an interest of fixed 5% on some notional principal amount, let's say $100 million, and B might say, I would be paying whatever is the prevailing interest rate at that particular point, prevailing rate at that particular point on the same $100 million. So the agreement could be in terms of cash flows, or probably it might so happen that A might be agreeing to pay B, let's say $100 every period, and B might agree to pay 6,000 Indian rupees every period. Probably this agreement could talk about payment every 6 months. The exact dates will be highlighted. The payments would be every 6 months, and uh, and for a 3 year period. Let's say that the duration of the payment also would be mentioned. So this is how a swap can be constructed. Generally what we see is the more prevalent and more popular kind of swaps we see today are, one, the interest rate swaps, where both the parties agree to pay different interest rates. So one may say fixed interest rate, the other may talk on floating interest rate on some notional amount for some period at specific intervals of time. So the cash flows payment could happen with respect to interest rates, where we call it as an interest rate swap, or generally it is based on an exchange rate, where we look at it as a currency swap. Though various other things are there, equity returns or probably commodity returns. So there are so many such kind of instruments where the cash flows on one reference is paid to the other party, and cash flows on some other reference is received from the other party. So this is how a swap contract gets constructed. And if I look at it logically, probably a swap is looked at like a series of forward contracts, because forward talks about one single settlement date, and on that day the whole settlement happening, whereas swap is looked at as multiple settlement periods. Whereas on the other side, probably whatever is agreed upon today, the settlement is happening at the end of the expiry of the contract. So forward is also more or less working in the same manner. So forwards and swaps bear a lot of similarities, except for the swap is something can be visualized as a series of forwards, and in majority of the swap cases, or in swaps case, it's only the cash flows that get exchanged, whereas in case of forwards, even there could be a delivery of the underlyings as well, right? So with that as a base, let's try to start understanding the interest rate swaps to start with, and then we'll slowly move towards the currency swaps as well. Typically, the interest rate swap, which is otherwise called as a plain vanilla swap, this talks about an exchange of fixed versus floating interest rate. One party pays fixed and receives the floating. This is the typical plain vanilla interest rate swap. But the amount, which is generally notional in nature, means no party needs to pay this amount. So they could say $100 million is the notional amount. On this notional amount, and the frequency of payment, let's say 6 months, the duration of the swap, let's say 3 years. One party is agreeing to pay a fixed rate on this notional amount, the other party is agreeing to pay a floating rate. So these are the important constituents that go as a part of the swap. So even the dimension for the floating, okay, it is going to receive LIBOR, or probably it is going to receive LIBOR plus 20 basis points, which is plus 0.2%. And the quote is on 6-month LIBOR. Even what LIBOR is typically being used, probably a 6-monthly LIBOR plus 0.2%, whatever is the interest rate that is there, that would be applicable on that 100 million, and whosoever is the floating rate payer, they would be paying that particular amount, and a fixed rate payer would be paying, let's say if they have agreed that they are going to pay 5% fixed, the fixed rate payer is going to pay the 5% to the other party. Now, typically, let's look at one simple swap transaction. Let's say X and Y. Two companies, X and Y, have got into an interest rate swap. X agrees to pay an interest rate of 5%, whereas Y agrees Y agrees to pay, let's say, an interest rate which is floating, and probably let's say this floating rate is a 6-month LIBOR. And here let's talk about $100 million being the notional amount, and let's say the duration of the swap is 3 years, the maturity of the swap is 3 years, and the payments frequency is 6 months, right? So in this case, X is called as a fixed rate payer because a fixed payment is being done, whereas Y is called as the floating rate payer. So the cash flows are exchanged every 6 months, and for a 3-year period. Now, let's assume the on 1st January 2014, the contract was entered into, and the LIBOR on that day, let's say we are talking about it as 4.5%. Now what we are saying is the